Hello, welcome back. I'm Savalian and I make videos about games, development, and creativity. This week's video is another update on my Game Dev December project. I'm working on my current game every day in December. That's the whole challenge, the whole project. I'm currently working on a fishing game with Godot, and I have just a couple of other videos about it, but it's a very new project and it's still kind of taking shape. One thing I knew that I wanted for my game is procedurally generated islands that the player can go fishing at. A lot of the stuff I'm still figuring out, still designing, but this is one of the things that I knew that I wanted to have. And I've never done procedural generation for terrain like this before, so I was excited to learn something new because it's kind of a big feature. And it did take me pretty much the whole week to figure out something that I was decently happy with, but I very neatly finished the sort of final implementation on Friday. So I got it done just in time for this video to have, like, from start to finish, the whole journey of learning this procedural generation. So my goal for the procedural generation right now is just to get a working prototype that can generate an island shape. I'm not really too worried about style or functional constraints, because I just want to nail down the basics. And while I have not implemented any procedural generation before, I have done some research. I've done a bit of research. I'm a big fan of Oscar Stolberg, who I think we can all agree is a master of procedural generation, especially with terrain and also especially for islands because of Bad North. You can't throw a procedurally generated rock on YouTube without hitting something that Oscar Stolberg has talked about and refined. He's the creator of Townscaper, Bad North, a bunch of other smaller projects, and also has done just like dozens of talks at conventions about procgen, talks about the algorithms, the style, getting a certain look, and also how it affects gameplay. So would definitely recommend checking him out. I also found a really nice, like, short and sweet video about wave function collapse by the YouTube channel TJ from their series on making a game in 1 month. And that was kind of the kicking off point. I started there and then I went a little bit deeper as I got kind of stuck. And so that was also a really good resource to check out. And I am making a separate video about the sort of final successful iteration of my procedurally generated island, where I'll go over the code and the models that I made and some of the gotchas. So this video is going to be more about the approach I took and some of the problems that I had to solve, and then I'm going to be making that other video that's going to be more of like a tutorial. And the day where this vlog picks up is day 3 of Game Dev December, so right after the last vlog. And the first thing I knew I would need is tiles for the procedural system to work with, so I modeled some in Blender. You can use placeholders or try to find free assets, but I tried to get them looking decent from the start, and I pretty much always make my own assets because I can, and I think it's fun. However, spoiler alert, I had to make a lot of changes to these models throughout the week. This first iteration was not it wasn't good enough for the final output. There's a couple of problems, but the first pass was decent to at least get started on the algorithm. And when figuring out which tiles I wanted to make, I started drawing out some notes by hand to try and think through how I wanted them to look and how the tiles would connect to each other. And I settled on this 2x2 grid for each tile. So each tile is 4 squares in that 2x2 grid, and each square can either be land or water. So for the minimum set that I would need, there are 16 different tiles. 1 that is all land, 1 that is all water, 4 that are 1 piece and the rest water, just sort of rotated, 4 that are 3 land pieces and 1 water, rotated, 2 diagonal pieces, and then 4 that are 2 land and 2 water in a row. And you could do 1 that you rotate in code. Instead, I just rotated them in Blender and exported them as separate tiles, mostly because I just didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to think about how I would calculate the compatible tiles when I had rotation involved as well. So I just did it sort of manually, but This might be something I go back and improve later. And I'll talk a little bit more about the issues with the meshes that I had to fix, but the most important thing is that tiles that can connect to each other should have those edge vertices at exactly the same place so that there's not a seam. And I initially added a little ledge below where they connected, and I was kind of thinking it would help close up any visual gap, but I discovered later that this is not a good idea, and the issue ended up boiling down to normals. So for anyone who doesn't know, the normal of a face is basically the way that it points, the way that it faces, and it's used for shading so that like a corner with the faces perpendicular to each other will look sharper than like two flat faces next to each other. They'll look more flat. And so by adding that little ledge, I was sort of tweaking the normal of that face so that when they were all put together, they had these shadows between them. And removing that little ledge fixed that. And then there were a couple of other normals that were a little bit weird that I had to adjust. But that's kind of the biggest thing that tripped me up, was getting those normals pointing in the right direction. After modeling the tiles, I did also need to get them into Godot in a way that would let me work with them with the algorithm. So I needed to be able to tell which edges were compatible with which other edges. I used Godot resources for this, which the internet told me are the closest thing to Unity's scriptable objects. And then each resource basically just has the mesh, and then it has a list of compatible blocks. So I started top left and went clockwise, and I just set it to land or water, the way that the 2x2 grid is set up. And that's how I compared the different tiles to each other. And then it was day 4, which is when I prototyped my algorithm. The basic approach I took from the start was to begin at the center tile, which was always a land, 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 land tile, so all land. And from there I would select a random edge that was open and then randomly pick a matching tile. This kind of worked, but it wasn't quite right for the wave function collapse algorithm that I was trying to use, and it caused some problems, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But day 5 and 6, I kind of took a detour and spent a lot of time in Blender trying to clean up the meshes so that they fit together more seamlessly. This is where I found the problem with the normals, and I just had to tweak them so that all the edges that connected to other tiles had the normals pointing outward as flat as possible so that they wouldn't create this like visible seam. And another thing I'll do soon that I didn't get to this week is take out the part of the mesh that represents the water. Since I have the water shader, all this does is limit how deep the sea can be, and I'd rather control that myself elsewhere. So I'm going to take it out of the tiles and just have the water shader plane handle that. Once I got my tiles cleaned up a bit more, they're not perfect, but they're better, I started trying to make the islands island-shaped. My idea for this was to, instead of just starting with that center tile, also start with a ring of water tiles around the outside of the island, and then use the algorithm to fill it in. In theory, this would create water around the outside and then randomly generate the island within. But I immediately ran into a problem with my algorithm. Because I was no longer starting from the middle and working my way out, I would sometimes end up with situations where two sides of an empty tile were impossible to solve with my current tile set. At first I thought I needed to change my tile set, so I wasted a night making very different tiles that I hated, where each side was only land or water, rather than the little 2x2 grid that I was using. But after I made those and hated them, I went back to my algorithm to see if I could try to make the original set work, and good news, I could. The key word here is entropy. I watched some more in-depth videos about wave function collapse algorithms and realized that I was missing a step in my solution. In other people's solutions, instead of picking like a random open tile, they picked the tiles with the fewest options so that they wouldn't end up with tiles that didn't have any viable options. It might still be possible to end up with an unsolvable island with my tile set, because if it happens to pick certain tiles around the edges, it could potentially eradicate all options, but so far I haven't seen that happen, so I'm just going to go with it. But by reworking my code to always select the next tile from the set of tiles that has the fewest options, I ended up with complete islands that don't have any weird holes in them. So day 7 is when I fixed my algorithm so that it actually works. And here's basically what the island generation function ended up looking like. And again, I'll go over this in a more formal tutorial video very soon. So don't worry if some details are missing here. It's just going to be kind of an overview. So step 1 is to create an empty grid of the size of the island that I want to generate. Instead of starting from the middle and expanding, I need to know which spaces are still available to be filled in. So I start with this sort of empty grid. Step 2, fill in the center land tile and a ring of water around the outside. This is to sort of force that island shape. And one improvement I want to make here is to not have the edges be perfectly square, because right now it creates some very blocky looking islands, and I think starting with more of a shape is going to create some more interesting island shapes. But for now, it is just a square of water tiles on the outside edge. Step 3, start looping until there are no empty tiles left. And then in each loop, the first thing I do is calculate how many viable options all of the remaining empty tiles have. So this is kind of that entropy value. And then I grab a random tile from the set of tiles that has the lowest number of options, and then pick which tile I want to put there. And really that's it. I just keep doing that in a loop until all the tiles have been filled in. And then I do have like a maximum number of loops just to prevent the case where it's unsolvable, to prevent it from just trying and trying forever in an infinite loop. And then step 4, I just take that list of tiles, that grid, and I render them out with the little prefabs that I've made for each one. So at that point, the islands are being generated. Now to get the islands sort of into the game. Day 7 was spent adding the water shader into the scene. I spent about 100 hours tweaking the shader settings to make it look right. It definitely still needs a little bit more of like color variation or like stylization, but it looks okay now. I also added collision meshes so that my character doesn't fall through the ground or walk right off the edge of the land into the water. I don't think I will have any sort of swimming or water exploration on this game, so I just put some invisible walls right on the edge of the land tiles. After I got all that in, I dropped my player into the scene, scaled the land pieces up a little bit because they were kind of small, and then now she can walk around. I didn't love how the horizon looked, so I fiddled with the environment and the camera settings for a very long time. It's still a little strange if you look too closely. The depth of field it's not quite right for the scene, but I'm going to solve that problem later. For now, it looks good enough to start piecing in some of the other features. So there I have it. I have a randomly generated island. My player can walk around on the island without falling off, and now I can start adding in some of the rest of the game. So that was the first full week of Game Dev December, and I'm pretty happy with how everything's going. My next focus is going to be on the actual fishing mechanics, so I can actually get the gameplay into the game instead of just setting the scene, and I'm very excited about that. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more updates for this game, other videos that I might make about games, development, creativity. We're also coming up on the new year, so there might be some goal setting videos on the horizon. I'm not sure quite yet, but I will be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Okay, bye-bye.